Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the settlement of the Northern Colonies in North America back in the 17th century.
And it's quite a contrast to the South, isn't it?
Absolutely. Religion seems to be the driving force here, much more so than maybe economic motives elsewhere.
That's right. If you look at New England especially, the society they built was just fundamentally shaped by the Protestant Reformation, Puritanism specifically.
Which itself grew out of Calvinism.
Yes, exactly. So you have these core Calvinist ideas really influencing them, things like predestination.
The idea that God's already decided who's saved and who isn't.
Right. And also covenant theology, this concept of a special agreement, a covenant between God and his people, both individually and as a community.
That must have created a certain intensity, living with that kind of belief system.
Oh, definitely. Imagine that constant uncertainty about salvation. It led to a really intense focus on personal piety, on examining your own life and, well, examining others' lives too, for signs of being among the elect, the saved.
Now, within this Puritan movement, we hear about Pilgrims and Puritans. Are they just different names for the same thing?
No, that's a really important distinction. It boils down to how they viewed the Church of England.
Okay.
The Pilgrims were separatists. They believed the Church of England was, frankly, beyond repair, too corrupt. They felt they had to completely separate, leave it, to form their own pure congregation.
And the Puritans.
They were non-separatists. They shared many of the criticisms, wanting to get rid of lingering Catholic elements. But they believed the church could be reformed, purified from within. That was their goal.
And it was the separatists, the Pilgrims, who first went to Holland.
That's right. Around 1608, facing pressure and persecution back in England for not conforming, a group of them fled to Leiden in Holland.
How did that work out?
They stayed for about 12 years. They found religious tolerance, yes, but economically, life was hard. They were often doing low-paid labor.
And there was another concern too, wasn't there, about their children?
Yes. That was maybe even more significant. They worried their children were losing their English identity, becoming too Dutch. They called it Dutchification. So that concern, plus the economic struggles and the continuing desire to practice their faith freely in their own community, pushed them to look towards America.
Which brings us to Plymouth Colony and the Mayflower in 1620. But they didn't actually land where they were supposed to, did they?
No, and that's crucial. Their patent, their legal permission to settle, was for land much further south, near the Hudson River, part of the Virginia Colony Grant.
So what happened?
Storms, maybe some navigation issues, pushed the Mayflower way north to Cape Cod. They ended up outside the bounds of their patent.
Which created a kind of legal vacuum.
Exactly. They had no official legal basis to govern themselves there. And remember, the passengers weren't all separatists. There were others, the strangers, who didn't necessarily share their religious goals.
So potential for chaos, maybe.
Definitely potential for disagreement or even rebellion. This situation is what led directly to the Mayflower Compact.
Often called a cornerstone of American self-government.
It is seen that way, but its origins were very practical, almost an emergency measure.
To keep things together.
Precisely. Before they even disembarked, the adult men, 41 of them, signed this agreement. They essentially promised to form a civil body politic and obey the laws they would create for themselves.
So it was about establishing order in that specific unforeseen situation.
Yes. It wasn't a constitution in our sense. It was a social contract based on consent, born out of necessity. They then elected John Carver as their first governor under its authority.
Okay, moving on a bit from that initial landing, we get to the first Thanksgiving. This story is, well, it's more complicated than the popular version, isn't it?
Oh, significantly more complicated. The traditional image often ignores the grim reality that preceded the Pilgrims' arrival.
Which was?
Devastating epidemics, probably introduced by earlier European fishermen or explorers between about 1616 and 1619. These diseases swept through the coastal native communities.
Particularly the Wampanoag.
Yes, the Wampanoag, the dominant group in that immediate area, were hit incredibly hard. Some estimates say they lost up to 90% of their population.
90%. That's staggering.
It is. It meant villages were empty, social structures were shattered. Interestingly, their main rivals, the Narragansett tribe further west, were largely spared by this particular wave of disease.
So the Pilgrims arrived to find a landscape dramatically altered by disease and a native power structure that was seriously weakened.
Exactly. And this context is crucial for understanding the relationship that developed. Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, the sachem, was in a precarious position.
Because of the population loss and the threat from the Narragansett.
Precisely. The Narragansett were still strong, the Wampanoag needed allies, and the Pilgrims, despite their own struggles, had something the Wampanoag didn't.
Guns.
Firearms, yes, that was a significant factor. So Massasoit saw a potential strategic advantage in aligning with these newcomers.
Which leads to the treaty in March 1621. This wasn't just a friendly welcome then.
No, it was a calculated diplomatic move. The treaty involved mutual promises, not to harm each other, to return stolen goods, and crucially, to aid each other if attacked unjustly.
Survival politics, really.
For both sides, absolutely. The Wampanoag needed allies against the Narragansett. The Pilgrims needed allies and local knowledge to survive.
And how does the Harvest Feast of 1621, the event we call Thanksgiving, fit into this?
Well, it certainly was a celebration of a successful harvest after a brutal first winter for the Pilgrims, but it was also very much a diplomatic event reaffirming that fragile alliance.
The fact that Massasoit showed up with about 90 of his men, that suggests more than just dropping by for dinner.
It does. It points to the political significance. And we should also remember the Wampanoag had their own long traditions of giving thanks and celebrating harvests. So it's a blending of cultures, yes, but rooted in that strategic necessity.
Okay, let's shift focus to the other major Puritan settlement, Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was established about 10 years after Plymouth, and it felt like a much more ambitious project from the start.
It really was. Larger scale, better financed, and driven by a powerful religious vision. This is where we get the famous phrase, city upon a hill.
Which comes from John Winthrop, their leader and first governor. He gave a sermon, a model of Christian charity, that laid this out.
Yes, probably aboard the flagship Arbella around 1630. It's a foundational text for understanding their purpose. One key thing they did was transfer the actual charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company to New England.
Why was that significant?
It gave them remarkable political autonomy, far from direct oversight in London. Winthrop's sermon then outlined the social vision. He talked about God ordaining a social hierarchy, some rich, some poor, but stressed the absolute necessity of Christian charity and mutual support. They had to act as one body.
And the city upon a hill part, it's often invoked today, sometimes in different ways. What did Winthrop mean by it then?
In its original context, it was less about boasting and more of a heavy warning. It tied into their covenant theology.
The agreement with God.
Exactly. Winthrop was saying, we've made a covenant with God to build this godly society. The eyes of the world are upon us. If we succeed, if we live up to our ideals of love and community, we'll be blessed and be a model for everyone.
But if they failed?
Then they would face God's wrath and bring shame upon their faith, becoming a cautionary tale. So it wasn't triumphalism. It was a statement of high stakes and immense pressure to succeed in their holy experiment.
This intense focus on being a godly society led to a very close relationship between church and state in Massachusetts Bay, didn't it? A Bible commonwealth.
Yes, though it wasn't a pure theocracy where ministers held political office. They actually believed in separating the roles. Ministers couldn't be governors, for instance.
But the government still enforced religious principles.
Absolutely. The civil government saw its role as upholding God's law, as interpreted by Puritan theology. Laws regulated behavior based on the Bible, mandatory church attendance, Sabbath observance, moral conduct.
And this directly impacted who could participate politically.
Critically so. To vote in colony-wide elections for the governor or the general court, you had to be a freeman. Initially, that meant stockholders in the company.
But they changed that.
Yes, fairly quickly. They extended freemanship to all adult male members of a Puritan congregation.
Which required proving a personal conversion experience.
Right. You had to convince the congregation you were one of the visible saints. So political power was effectively restricted to those deemed godly, ensuring the colony stayed true to its religious mission. Non-church members have very limited political voice at the colony level.
A system designed for unity. But it seems like it set the stage for conflict if anyone disagreed with that orthodoxy.
It inevitably did. The pressure for conformity was immense, and when individuals challenged the prevailing interpretations or authority, the response could be harsh.
Which brings us to figures like Roger Williams.
Exactly. Williams is a fascinating example of dissent. He arrived in 1631, a respected minister, but quickly clashed with the leadership.
What were his main points of contention?
Several key things. He argued for a complete separation of church and state. A wall of separation, he called it, between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world.
Which directly contradicted the Massachusetts model.
Completely. He believed government involvement corrupted religion. He also championed liberty of conscience.
Meaning religious tolerance.
Going further than just tolerance, Williams argued for true freedom for all beliefs, even for non-Christians or atheists. He felt compelling worship was hypocrisy.
And he had another controversial view about land, didn't he?
Yes, based on his interactions with Native Americans, he argued that the King of England had no right to grant away native land. He insisted the colonists should purchase it fairly from the actual inhabitants.
These were radical ideas for the time. How did the authorities react?
They saw them as new and dangerous opinions, threatening their whole society and its legal basis. After debates and warnings, Williams refused to back down and was banished in the winter of 1635-36.
Where did he go?
He fled south, survived with help from native tribes, and eventually purchased land from the Narragansett to found Providence in 1636.
The beginning of Rhode Island.
Yes, established specifically as a refuge for soul liberty for those distressed of conscience. Its government was civil, based on majority rule among the settlers, explicitly separate from religious matters. Rhode Island later got official charters guaranteeing that religious freedom, making it a unique, lively experiment.
Another major dissenter was Anne Hutchinson. Her story seems to involve not just theology, but also gender roles.
Very much so. The antinomian controversy, around 1636-1638, centered on Hutchinson, but exposed deep tensions in Massachusetts society.
What was she doing that caused such alarm?
Hutchinson was incredibly intelligent, charismatic, and theologically astute. She started holding meetings in her Boston home to discuss the weekly sermons.
Just discussing sermons.
It started that way, but they grew very popular, attracting men and women, including prominent figures. They evolved into forums where Hutchinson offered her own interpretations and critiques.
And her theological point was about the covenant of grace versus the covenant of works.
That was the core of it. She accused most of the colony's ministers of preaching a covenant of works, essentially saying good behavior and following laws could be evidence of salvation.
Implying people could earn salvation.
Or at least demonstrate it through outward actions. Hutchinson stressed the covenant of grace, the belief that salvation comes only through God's free grace, completely unearned and felt inwardly. She suggested many ministers hadn't truly experienced this grace themselves.
That sounds like a direct challenge to their authority.
It absolutely was. Her opponents feared her ideas would lead to antinomianism, literally against the law, a belief that if you're saved by grace, moral law doesn't apply to you. They worried about social chaos.
But her being a woman was also a huge factor.
Undeniably. In that patriarchal society, a woman publicly teaching theology, critiquing male ministers, that was seen as completely out of line. Governor Winthrop explicitly called her out during her trial for stepping outside the expected role of her sex.
So the challenge was theological and social.
Yes. Her intelligence and influence were threatening enough, but her gender magnified the perceived threat to the established order.
What ultimately led to her banishment?
During her trial in 1637, under intense questioning, she claimed to receive direct, immediate revelations from God.
Like a prophet.
That's how they saw it. For the Puritans, the age of direct revelation ended with the Bible. Claiming personal revelations put her authority above Scripture and the ministry. That was heresy.
So she was banished.
Yes, convicted of heresy and sedition. Like Williams, she initially went to Rhode Island, then later moved to New Netherland, where she and most of her family were killed in an attack by Native Americans a few years later. A tragic end to a powerful story about dissent and gender norms.
Moving away from these high-profile conflicts, let's think about everyday governance and life. We often hear about New England town meetings. How did those work?
They were a really distinctive feature, usually held in the meeting house. These gatherings allowed eligible residents to handle local affairs directly.
What kind of things?
Setting local taxes, deciding how to distribute town lands, managing the school, choosing local officials like selectmen or constables. It was local self-government in action.
But who were the eligible residents? Not everyone could participate equally, I assume?
No, definitely not by our standards. Initially, voting rights, especially on important matters, were usually restricted to adult men who were church members and owned property.
So quite exclusionary.
Yes. Women, non-church members for colony-wide matters, the poor without property, servants, Native Americans, enslaved people, they were all excluded from this formal political process. And even among the eligible, there was strong pressure for consensus and conformity to Puritan values.
So an early form of local democracy, but with significant limitations.
That's a good way to put it. A step towards government by consent for a specific group, but also a way to enforce community standards.
What about education and family? The Puritans seem to have valued education highly.
Extremely highly, but primarily for religious reasons. The core belief was that everyone needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves.
Literacy was key to faith.
Exactly. This led them to establish schools very early on. Harvard College was founded in 1636, mainly to ensure a supply of educated ministers who could read scripture in the original languages.
And for the general population.
Massachusetts passed laws in the 1640s, like the famous Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647 that required towns of a certain size to establish schools to teach reading and writing, and larger towns to set up Latin grammar schools to prepare boys for Harvard.
Did girls get any education?
They often learned basic literacy, sometimes in informal dame schools run by women in their homes, primarily so they could read the Bible and catechisms. But higher education and grammar schools were for boys.
And the family structure itself.
It was strongly patriarchal. The husband was the undisputed head of the household, legally and socially responsible for his wife, children, and any servants.
Women's roles were primarily domestic.
Yes, focused on managing the household, raising children, and often contributing economically through activities like gardening, dairying, or spinning. Legally, under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's.
Yet women clearly played vital roles.
Absolutely vital. Despite the legal subordination, women's work was essential to the family's survival and well-being. It was a hierarchical society overall, based on wealth, family standing, church membership, gender, but with an ideal of competency, having enough to support your family comfortably.
Now we have to address the relationship with the Native American populations. While the colonists were building this society, it had a huge impact on the people already there.
A profound and overwhelmingly negative impact over time. While there were initial periods of cooperation, like the early Wampanoag Pilgrim Alliance, the story of the 17th century is largely one of increasing conflict, displacement, and violence.
The Pequot War in the 1630s seems like a major turning point.
It was. Fought between 1636 and 1637, it was brutal and decisively shifted the power balance in southern New England.
What were the underlying causes?
It was complex. Competition over the fur trade, especially access to wampum, which became a form of currency, was a big factor. English settlers were pushing westward into the fertile Connecticut River Valley, encroaching on lands the Pequot controlled.
And existing native rivalries played a part.
Yes, the English allied with the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, who were rivals of the Pequot. Then, the deaths of a couple of English traders were used as justifications for escalating demands and ultimately military action by the English.
The war culminated in the Mystic Massacre, which sounds horrific.
It was. In May 1637, English forces, with their Narragansett and Mohegan allies, attacked a fortified Pequot village at Mystic. They set it on fire and killed hundreds. Estimates range from 400 to 700, mostly non-combatants, women, and children. It was less a battle, more a slaughter.
What were the consequences for the Pequot?
Near annihilation. Many survivors were killed or captured and sold into slavery, either in the Caribbean or dispersed among other tribes. The Treaty of Hartford in 1638 formally dissolved the Pequot Nation, took their lands, and even made it illegal to say their name.
A chilling example of the violence inherent in colonization.
It truly is. And it demonstrated the English willingness to use overwhelming force and paved the way for further expansion.
Beyond war, displacement also happened through treaties and land deals, often unequal ones.
Yes, the whole process was fraught with misunderstanding and exploitation. European ideas of exclusive private land ownership clashed completely with native concepts of communal use and sovereignty.
So even when land was supposedly purchased.
It often involved pressure, unclear terms, or outright fraud from the colonists' perspective, while natives might have seen it as granting permission to share the land, not permanently sell it. And remember, the impact of disease weakened native communities were less able to resist demands for land. The treaties that followed conflict, like the Treaty of Hartford, simply dictated terms to the defeated.
So we have Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay established, but settlement didn't stop there. People moved out, founding other colonies like Connecticut.
Right. Starting in the mid-1630s, groups from Massachusetts began moving west into the Connecticut River Valley. Reasons varied. Looking for better farmland was certainly one.
Maybe also seeking a bit more political space than Massachusetts offered. Thomas Hooker, a key figure in founding Hartford, had some disagreements with the leadership in Boston.
That's often suggested. And significantly, in 1639, the Connecticut settlements adopted the Fundamental Orders.
Sometimes called the first written constitution in America.
It's considered a landmark. It set up a government structure with an elected governor and legislature, and importantly, it didn't require church membership to vote, at least not for all levels initially, unlike Massachusetts Bay at the time. It derived its authority from the inhabitants, not explicitly from the king.
And what about New Hampshire to the north?
New Hampshire's origins were a bit different, less driven by a single religious migration. Early activities focused on fishing and the fur trade, linked to land grants given to proprietors like Mason and Gorges in the 1620s.
So more economic motivations initially?
Somewhat, yes. Settlements like Portsmouth and Dover emerged. It had a period of instability with competing claims and was actually governed by Massachusetts Bay from 1641 for about 4 decades.
But it eventually became separate.
Yes, it became a distinct royal colony in 1679, was briefly part of the Dominion of New England later, and then reestablished as its own royal province in 1691. So a more fragmented early history compared to Massachusetts or Connecticut.
Okay, so wrapping this up, when we look at the Northern Colonies in this period, it's a really complex picture. Deep religious conviction driving settlement.
Absolutely. That Puritan drive to create a godly society is central.
But also leading to experiments in government, like the town meetings or the fundamental orders, even if participation was limited.
Right, early forms of self-rule, alongside that strong community ideal.
And then there's the darker side, the intolerance towards dissenters like Williams and Hutchinson, and the devastating impact on Native Americans through disease, dispossession, and war.
It's crucial to acknowledge all those dimensions. The story we often get is simplified, missing the internal conflicts and the profound consequences for indigenous peoples.
It really underscores that the history is rarely straightforward.
And never just black and white. Always shades of gray, competing motivations, unintended consequences.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Think about this duality in early New England, this intense pursuit of religious freedom for themselves, coexisting with the strict enforcement of conformity and intolerance for others. How did that foundational tension shape the future development of American ideas about liberty, religion, and society?
It's a tension we still grapple with today, isn't it? What does it mean when a society is founded on specific beliefs? And what happens to those who don't fit the mold? Something definitely worth considering.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes. Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.